Ford did things much different, offering several performance packages that often weren't specific to the big engine versions, unless you count the Thunderbolt, a mid-size superstock for 1964. Technically a homologation special, these Fairlanes with a modified 7-liter 427 wedged into them were very much not road cars. But 1966 added a couple of sporty packages, which included the Extra Lively, or XL, that provided no actual performance, just things like bucket seats and white wall tires, and could be had with any engine. The actual performance package at the time was the GT and GTA, which started with a 335 horsepower 6.4-liter Thunderbird 390, with the GTA adding a Sport Shift Cruise-O-Matic. The 4-speed GT was a high 14-second car with a top speed over 115 miles an hour. Ford also offered a 7-liter 427 as an option, but only in the base Fairlane 500, and only 57 were made. It was rated at 425 horsepower, and only available with the 4-speed, making for a low 13-second quarter mile. For 1967, it could be combined with the XL package. The cars got a restyle for 1968 that included a fastback. The top models became Torinos, which is where the GT and GTA packages landed, which were available with GT Performance suspension and GT stripes and a hood scoop. But they moved to a standard 4.9-liter 302 with 210 horsepower, making the 390 the option, as was the new 428 Cobra jet that replaced the 427. Marketed as having 335 horsepower, many considered it underrated, but it moved the car to a high 14-second quarter mile, and was soon offered as the only engine in the Cobra, essentially the same car, but with more subdued trim and fewer features, sometimes referred to as either the Fairlane Cobra or the Torino Cobra. It was badged as neither. And in 1969, the GT would get an available 5.8-liter 351 Windsor, with 250 to 290 horsepower, and being a mid-15-second car. There was also a limited Torino-Talladega Aero package for the year, developed for NASCAR, with just over 750 made. They would be restyled once again for 1970. The 390 was gone, but a 351 Cleveland was added, providing 300 horsepower. And the 428 would be replaced by a 429 Cobra jet with 360 to 370 horsepower, which was now the engine that came in the Cobra, with a similar high 14-second quarter mile and 135 mile-an-hour top speed to the outgoing model, in spite of the weight gained. An Aero King Cobra based on it was developed, but canceled after 3 prototypes were built. Power was down for the mid-range engines of 1971. The 351 Windsor was at 240 horsepower, and the 351 Cleveland 285, which became the standard engine on the Cobra. With the restyle of 1972, the Torino GT became the Grand Torino Sport, and the Cobra was discontinued. Engines mostly carried over, but the move to the net ratings had the advertised numbers down. 140 for the 302, 161 for the 351 Windsor, and 208 for the 429. There was a new 6.6-liter 400, rated at 168 horsepower, but the performance option was the 351 Cobra jet, based on the Cleveland and offering 248 horsepower net, meaning it was still a mid-15-second car, with a top speed near 130. Horsepower would only fluctuate slightly going forward, but cars would keep getting heavier, and 1974 would see the end of the Sport and the 351 Cleveland. And the 220 horsepower 460 that replaced the 429 was hardly a performance engine, being marketed more towards towing, and it was only offered with an automatic, making it a low 17-second car. Mercury introduced the Cyclone in 1964 as the performance version of the compact Comet. No slouch, it was powered by a 210 horsepower 4.7-liter 289 for a mid-16-second quarter mile and speeds over 110. But in 1966, the Comet essentially became the same car as the Ford Fairlane, and the Cyclone had a standard 390 with 265 horsepower, an optional 275 horsepower version, and the Cyclone GT with 335 horsepower, which was also available with an automatic as the Cyclone GTA. For 1967, the base engine was reduced to a 210 horsepower 289. The FE429 was offered in the base Comet as an option, but not in the Cyclone, except as a rare dealer-installed option. With the restyle of 1968, the Comet became the Montego, but the Cyclone carried over. The base 289 was replaced by a 302 with 210 to 230 horsepower, and the 390 in the Cyclone GT was offered in 265 to 325 horsepower, and the 335 horsepower 428 Cobra jet would become optional. There was some reshuffling for 1969. The 302 had 220 horsepower, the new 351 Windsor 250 to 290 horsepower, and the 390 in the GT had 320, but 325 in the new Cyclone spoiler. But there was also a new Cyclone Spoiler 2 aimed at NASCAR. It included an aero treatment and was offered in either Cale Yarborough Special or Dan Gurney Special with red or blue trim. And although the racing versions used an engine based on the 429 Boss, the street version had a standard 351 Windsor with a column shift automatic. The 335 horsepower 428 carried over, but was now its own model as the Cyclone Cobra jet. The cars were restyled again for 1970, but packages got a bit confusing. The base Cyclone used a 429 with 360 gross horsepower, or 250 net. The optional 370 gross horsepower, or 305 net horsepower 429 Cobra jet was standard on the Cyclone spoiler, which also included a tach, 140 mile-an-hour speedometer, and bucket seats, and optionally had the 375 gross horsepower, or 335 net horsepower, 429 Super Cobra jet, and drag pack limited slip differential. While the Cyclone GT was much better equipped overall, but the standard engine was a 351 with 250 to 300 gross horsepower. The planned Spoiler 2 never made it into production. With the restyle of 1972, the Cyclone was no longer its own model, becoming the Montego GT and Montego GT Cyclone, offered with either a 248 net horsepower 351 Cobra jet or a 205 horsepower 429, with a total of 30 being made, spelling the end of the Cyclone. Dodge came into the muscle car arena strong in 1966 with the new limited production Charger. Based on the Coronet, it had aero styling as well as a distinct interior, starting just over $3,100. The standard engine was a rather mundane 5.2-liter 318 with 230 horsepower, but options climbed quickly through a 5.9-liter 361, 6.3-liter 383, 7-liter 426 Hemi, and 7.2-liter 440, with horsepower ranging from 265 to 425, with the Hemi being capable of a mid to high 13-second quarter mile, and speeds near 150 miles an hour. It was joined the next year by the Coronet RT, or Road and Track, that started around $3,200, offering engines not available in lesser Coronets, starting with a base 375 horsepower 7.2-liter 440 Magnum, making it a low 14-second car, and for an additional $900, got an optional 425 horsepower 7-liter 426 Street Hemi. But the Coronet RT and Charger combined amounted to less than 30,000 cars, both of which would be restyled for 1968, and the overall shape was much more similar, as the Charger moved somewhat down market. It gained an RT package of its own, but the Charger was still quite distinct with its unique hidden headlight grille, while the base Charger was reduced to a 3.7-liter 225/6. But the new styling proved to be much more popular, and overall Charger sales were 3 times what was planned for the year, nearly reaching 100,000. And the Coronet RT would be joined by the slightly cheaper Super B, with a standard 335 horsepower 383, and the Charger instrument cluster. But it too could be had with a 426 Hemi, putting it well into the 13-second range. For 1969, there were a couple of noteworthy changes, including the introduction of the Charger 500, an attempt to make the Charger RT more aerodynamic than it was in its standard form. Changes included a flush-mounted rear window, and the Coronet grille pushed to the front edge of the bumper, except on the Charger Daytona, improving the aerodynamics of the Charger 500. It gained an 18-inch nose cone and a 2.5-foot wing for NASCAR dominance, while the Super Bee introduced a 440 pack. Equipped with 3 two-barrel carburetors, it produced 390 gross horsepower, making it a 14-second car. An engine that would make it into the Charger and Coronet RT for 1970, each receiving a facelift, with the Coronets being more extensive with a new split grille. But with the restyled cars of 1971, the Coronet was only offered as a 4-door, and the RT was gone. The Super Bee name carried on, but was now a package on the new Charger, which was offered with an optional rear spoiler and Ram Charger pop-up scoop. Engines carried over, with the addition of a 275 gross horsepower, 5.6-liter 340. 1972 models saw some shuffling, including the move to net horsepower ratings, which had the slant 6 at 110, the 318 was down 5 to 150, the 340 was 240, and the 440 was down 25 to 280. The 383 was replaced by a bigger 6.6-liter 400 with 190 to 255 horsepower, which was actually up 5. But the 446 pack and the Hemi were discontinued. The RT package was replaced by the Rally package, and there was a new SE package that included a formal roof and hidden headlights, which were otherwise optional. The Super Bee name was dropped after the end of the year, although it would be used on a version of the V8 Demon in some export markets through 1976. For 1974, the 340 was replaced by a 5.9-liter 360, but in the Charger, output was down to 200, and they would be restyled for 1975, with a more formal look to better compete with Chevy's Monte Carlo, offered in Special Edition or SE, and the revived Daytona, being an appearance package. Engines included the 318, the 360, which was down to 180 to 190 horsepower, and a torquier 190 horsepower 400. 1976 added the Charger Sport, which was really just a 2-door Coronet, being the last year of the Coronet. But the 400 would get a performance option, bumping power back up to 240. In 1978, the Charger was replaced by the Magnum, although the two cars would overlap, and the Magnum was effectively the same car, just with a facelift, itself only lasting 2 years, before the name was used on an updated version of the Dart for export markets. Plymouth introduced its gentleman's muscle car in 1967 with the Belvedere-based GTX, offered with a base 375 horsepower Super Commando 440 or an optional 426 Hemi, making for a low 14 or mid-13 second quarter mile, only to be restyled as a bigger, heavier, and more curvaceous car for 1968. At which point it was joined by what was essentially a stripper version, sold as the Roadrunner, so stripped down that even roll-down rear windows were an option, and the base engine was reduced to a 335 horsepower 383. But it did include decals and a horn based on the Looney Tunes Roadrunner cartoon character, and the $2,900 Roadrunner quickly stole sales from the $500 more expensive GTX, just over $45,000 compared to just under $20,000. For 1969, the Roadrunner gained an optional 390 horsepower 6-barrel version of the 440 and a vacuum-actuated air grabber air intake. A facelift for 1970 added available front disc brakes and a fake side scoop, and an aero package similar to Dodge's Daytona as the Superbird Roadrunner. The 446 pack became available on the GTX, but its sales continued to decline. The cars would be restyled for 1971, getting Chrysler's more muscular fuselage styling. Drivetrain changes included the addition of a 300 horsepower version of the 383 in the Roadrunner, and the 444 barrel was down 5 horsepower to 370 gross, or 305 net. For 1972, the 446 pack and the 426 Hemi were gone, and the GTX became an options package on the Roadrunner instead of being its own model. The 340 was rated at 240 horsepower, and the new 400 at 255, and the 440 280 with the move to net ratings. Safety regulations forced a facelift for 1973, and the GTX option was discontinued. But even with the added weight, the Roadrunner could still be a sub-15-second car. The cars were restyled for 1975, and the 440 was dropped, leaving a 235 horsepower 400 as the top engine, but only with an automatic. Being even heavier than the previous car, it now took 17 seconds to do the quarter mile. In 1976, the Roadrunner name would be moved to the performance version of the new compact Volare, available with the 318 or 360. Horsepower range from 140 to 170, making it a fraction quicker than the outgoing car. Power was up to 195 for 1979, but it became an appearance package, available even on the base Slant 6 Volare. And the 360 was dropped for 1980, leaving the 155 horsepower 318 as the top engine in its last year. AMC even got into the act. In fact, some would argue that the 1957 Rambler Rebel was actually the first muscle car. Powered by a 215 horsepower 5.4-liter 327 in a lightweight package, it made for a 17-second sedan. And the Rebel name would be revived for the new mid-size models of 1967. And mid-year 1968, it would gain a new 315 horsepower 7.2-liter 390 as an option in the high-level SST package. But the real muscle came in 1970 with The Machine, adding special heads, valve train, cam, intake, and exhaust. Output of the 390 was bumped to 340 horsepower, and it had a distinct hood scoop and red, white, and blue decal package. It was a high 14-second car with a top speed near 120, but it was only offered for 1 year with less than 2,000 sold. The following year, the Rebel was replaced by the Matador, and the muscle car option became the Machine Go package. The engines were a 5.9-liter 360 and 6.6-liter 401 with 285 or 330 horsepower, but only 50 were made. These wouldn't be the last muscle cars, but high costs, high insurance premiums, and the fuel crisis effectively put an end to the original muscle car era. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.